Ebrahim Fakir is a political analyst, joins us now. Ebrahim, in many ways, the story of what's happening in the metros has focused on the big three, and it's eclipsed the other metros that are very much also an important part of the South African political landscape.
Well, I think that's an important point. It's something important to note that there are 8 metros in the country. There appears to be a fixation on the 3. I can imagine why. These are fundamentally the drivers of growth, of economic opportunity, of employment, and of economic growth generally. So they're important players in the South African political landscape and the economic landscape. And latterly, of course, also because these are the results everyone's waiting for. But I think what focusing on the other 5 metros does is that it does place into perspective the performance of the ANC. So it's not as cataclysmic as people appear to suggest. It is bad, and they need to take this message very carefully and read it very carefully. But one has to also keep in perspective that they maintain support in those other 5 metros, firstly, and secondly, that their vote share, though it's come down, is still comfortably nationally around 54%. Now, of course, for a local election, that doesn't matter, because what happens is what matters is the support you command in a specific geographic locality. So of course, they need to take lessons very carefully about this. But I think they need to look, and particularly this focus on the 3 metros, to return to your point about Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, and Johannesburg in particular, is one has to take a long historical view. And that long historical view, in my view, tries to ignore the role of the decimation and the fragmentation of the labor movement, but also the independent civic organizations which contributed to the way in which a cosmopolitan political identity, particularly aligned to the ANC, was often brought out through institutional form, through organized labor. Now, with the retreat of COSATU, the fragmentation, NUMSA leaving the alliance, and COSATU in particular, 8 unions leaving the COSATU fold or not being affiliates of COSATU anymore. I think that institutional attrition and organizational attrition has had a fundamental impact in 2 ways. One, practically, they were unable to get the organizational feet on the ground to get urban voters out, firstly. Secondly, the ideological line of march, which probably appealed to a broad MDM, mass democratic movement type consensus, also appeared to have fragmented. And so the ANC was left with just 2 messages. One is, look what we've done in the metros where we did govern, and look what we're going to try and promise you through our manifesto.
So does the ANC, ahead of the national election coming up in 2 years' time, need to look out and start rebuilding those relationships, or is that an opportunity that is now lost and squandered within that union movement?
In some senses, it appears as if it's a little too late, much like the way in which they ran their campaign. But this is not entirely dependent on the ANC. It is dependent on COSATU as an independent member of the alliance. So I think it's important to bear in mind that COSATU and the union movement and organized labor does remain separate from the ANC. But the ANC's own internal fractures have determined the way in which these fractures and fragmentation played out in COSATU. So there is that relationship. But fundamentally, this relationship is for COSATU to rebuild. Whether they can reach out to NUMSA or whether NUMSA can reach out to them is a different question. But I think that there are 2 points that emerge here for all of those who watch, is that even though NUMSA through the United Front didn't really contest this election as an organized form, clearly their influence outside of the alliance generally has been minimal. But for the ANC, the lesson is pretty much clear. Without this organized labor capacity, we have been unable to get out a very important component of the vote, of those people who might have actually supported us but simply stayed away.
You know what's interesting in what you say, Ebrahim, is that there has been a common refrain of the ANC not seeing the obvious. The signs were there. You know, a lot of what is happening insofar as voting patterns or areas where there have been flashpoints of violence, and Tshwane immediately springs to mind. And speaking to a lot of people who kept saying, well, we red flagged this with the ANC, we kept telling them, but we weren't being listened to. How do you think they got into a place where there seems to be that dissonance between them and their core supporters? And then who needs to take responsibility for not keeping them sort of real and grounded?
I'm afraid we're looking for scapegoats, and I suppose the ANC and their alliance partners will also be looking for scapegoats.
And that's inevitable.
But that's inevitable. But the scapegoats are not going to be found in one place. There are deep historical roots to how this unfolded, and it goes back to everyone's favorite saint, Saint Nelson Mandela. Also, at his swan song conference in 1997, spoke very vigorously against independent organization outside the ANC, firstly. Secondly, he warned COSATU about, though he was quite inclusive in how he wanted to keep them in the fold of the alliance, did tell them to watch their back in terms of the kind of policy concessions that they sought. Under Thabo Mbeki, of course, one will remember the strained relations between COSATU and the SACP in particular. So the work started institutionally and organizationally under Mbeki has come to fruition under Zuma. Now, of course, under Zuma, people might argue that this was done in terms of protecting his own interest inside the alliance and inside the ANC in particular. But there's a different ideological approach to this too, that there weren't enough concessions made by the ANC in terms of the policy concessions that COSATU required. So there's both an organizational problem as well as institutional policy ideological problem. And so the roots are quite deep, but the systematic attrition has now come to reveal itself in a way in which they are unable to rely on this organized form and the social networks that they belong to.